Good day. I'm really happy to be here today to have the honor of introducing Ambassador Ido Aharoni, a Global Distinguished Professor at New York University's Program of International Relations in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. Ambassador Aharoni is a 25-year veteran of Israel's Foreign Service, and he's a public diplomacy specialist and a founder of Brand Israel. We're very lucky to have Ambassador Aharoni here. He's held two of Israel's most prestigious diplomatic positions, serving as the Consul General in Los Angeles and in New York. Ambassador Aharoni served as a senior advisor and a press secretary to Israel's foreign minister and vice prime minister, during which time he introduced the concept of country positioning as a pillar of Israel's public diplomacy and foreign policy. For me, as a diplomat, it is such an honor to be here with you, Ambassador. And it's great virtually and have you in Tijuana with us. I have so many questions for you. I hope we have enough time today, and I hope we can bring a little bit of your expertise to our Cali Baja region. You are clearly one of the foremost practitioners of what we diplomats call public diplomacy. But speaking diplomat to diplomat, I think you and I both understand what we mean by that. But I'm not sure if our audience has the background and understands what we mean when we say public diplomacy and how important it is when you're serving your country. Could you tell us a little bit what we mean by that term?
Yes. So first of all, I wanted to thank you for your very, very kind introduction. And the honor is all mine to be introduced and to be in this session with you, an esteemed diplomat who served among many places in Jerusalem. So we have a lot in common. I'm actually right now in Jerusalem and you're in Tijuana, and it's a lovely encounter thanks to technology and thanks to the Innovadora. Public diplomacy. Public diplomacy, there are several ways to describe what it means, but I think the easiest way is to tell our viewers that if an embassy is in charge of government-to-government relations, usually a consulate general is more engaged in people-to-people, regional, state level kind of work. And that really is the idea behind public diplomacy. Public diplomacy is the kind of diplomacy that takes place community to community, people to people. We're using all the softer elements that nations have to offer. It's about the culture, it's about the science, it's about the knowledge, it's about the spirit of the nation, not so much about economic sanctions or military power so public diplomacy is the other level of diplomacy that exists. And if you ask me personally, I think it's the only kind of diplomacy that remains today because technology in many ways confiscated all the traditional tasks of diplomacy. So the diplomat as an analyst is gone. It was gone the moment search engines appeared. The diplomat as an advocate is gone. It's gone because technology is allowing policymakers to announce their policies directly above the heads of the traditional mediators. So the only thing that is left for the new diplomat, for the modern diplomat, is to think and function like he or she are the chief marketing officers of their nation, meaning public diplomacy is all about being able to market your country's assets, the values, the spirit of the nation. In the case of the United States, obviously, the American national ethos, America as a land of opportunity. The DNA of the United States as a brand is all about freedom. And it's a wonderful, wonderful asset to work with.
That's a very good explanation of it, I think. And it is a very good description of how diplomacy has evolved over the last few years with technology. You're right, our role is changing. And I do agree with you that the Consul General role is probably the most fun job in diplomacy because we are doing the people to people. That's especially what I like about being here in Tijuana. But it does make it sound a little bit that you might be like the American TV show Mad Men with, sitting in New York City in the skyscrapers like Don Draper, cooking up advertising strategies for a country. Is that really what, is that an accurate characterization of what we do in public diplomacy?
Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that, marketing and advertising campaigns are part of what you need to do in order to reach out to large audiences. But it would be a mistake to think that it begins and ends with campaigns. The task of managing the performance and the image of a country or a region or a city is a never ending task. So it's not about a campaign. A campaign is one of the tools that you can use in the process. But I was lucky because I served in New York twice. The first time from 2001 to 2005, I came to New York as Consul for Media and Public Affairs. Israel's largest media relations apparatus is based in New York until this very day. And I came about 3 months before 9/11. And 9/11 was the event that really prompted this process of soul searching. And in the process, I met with many people on Madison Ave, just like as you described. In fact, some of them were from Young and Rubicam, which I believe is the company the show was modeled after. And one of them later on became the CEO of Young and Rubicam. But they were very generous with me, with their knowledge, with their time, with their experience, and also with their money, because most of you have to understand, the Israeli government was so um, deeply entrenched in the old classical diplomacy that when I came up with the idea of let's look at Israel the way you look at any other brand, there was a tremendous pushback. And so there was no money. And Young and Rubicam donated all the early studies that were, this is a huge advantage that an Israeli diplomat has in New York that I think that no other diplomat could have. So the advantage that I had was that I had access to all those great minds on Madison Avenue, on the research side, on the strategy side, and then on the executional level as well. And that was really the beginning of it. And then I came back to New York in 2010, this time as Consul General, and I was there for 6 years, and I was given the opportunity to implement everything that I learned from the best. And I really learned from the best of the best that marketing research has to offer in the United States.
Fascinating. And it is interesting to see how certainly that post 9/11 period was very challenging for all of us, but also for countries trying to find their way in sort of that post 9/11 reality. I think that's a challenge. The Brand Israel program, you mentioned to me when we talked that you change it to, now you call it positioning rather than branding. Branding has sort of, as you, like the marketing label. But why do countries or places or regions actually need to be positioned for other people in the world? Like you say, with technology, we have access to everything. With the cell phone and a Google search, we can find out just about anything about a place. Why do they need positioning?
Because most places are very frustrated. There is this thing called brand deficit. There are very few places that enjoy a brand surplus, meaning that the brand is stronger than the place. I think one perfect example is Brazil. But most places are suffering from what we call brand deficit, meaning the place, at least in the eyes of the stakeholders, is far more attractive and superior to the brand. What is the brand? The brand is the total sum of experiences, emotions, and associations that we attach to either a product, a place, a human being, an institution, an organization, an ideology, a religion. These are all brands. And so sometimes the brand is bigger than the subject matter, and sometimes it's smaller than the subject matter. In case the brand is smaller, it's called brand deficit. This is the case of Israel, for example. Israelis will tell you that their place is far more attractive than it's being portrayed outside, externally. So that frustration is a great motivator for decision makers all over the world to try and improve the way their place is being perceived, experienced. The way to do it is to improve the overall performance of the place. The best example was New York of the 1970s, that was on the verge of economic bankruptcy and then bounced back during the 1980s, the 1990s, and certainly during Mayor Bloomberg's time as mayor. And it really became one of the strongest city brands in the world, on the top of the list together with London. And so it's a perfect example of how, in less than 30 years, a major city like New York was able to improve its overall performance, upgrade its performance in almost all aspects. Obviously, COVID-19 has now changed everything in New York, but that's really the motivation. The motivation is economic. It has a lot to do with the image of the place. It has a lot to do with the ability to be attractive. One of the most famous sayings of public diplomacy is that it's important to be right, but it's no less important to be attractive. And traditional diplomacy is all about being right. It's all about advocating policy. It's all about winning an imaginary debate by using historical and legal arguments. And public diplomacy, modern diplomacy, is about the understanding that it is no less important to be attractive than to be right. Because if you're attractive as a place, as a nation, as a culture, then it's easier for you to do all the other things. Let me give you an example. The United States, and as you can tell, I'm a big fan of Brand USA. The one thing that makes the United States such a powerful brand, and I really disregard all the nation brand index and so on, the United Nations Human Development Index, and even the OECD rankings, because at the end of the day, the United States as a brand is in a league of its own. Why? Because when you look at all the things that matter, for example, when you look at the list of the top 100 strongest brand names in the world, over 80% of them were originated in the United States. When you look at Hollywood today, it's the number one change agent in the world. When you consider culture today, popular culture, by and large, is American popular culture. When you look at the most popular sporting brand in China, it's the NBA. When you look at what is it that people consume, what kind of music is dominant all over the world, what kind of televisions, now with the streaming services, it's even easier for American culture to have access to almost every community in the world. And the language, thanks to the internet, the language that is the global language today is American English, not British English. With the exception of China and a few other countries in Asia, the international language today in the world, thanks to the internet, is American English. And so that's the power of the United States as a brand. It sets the agenda. Let's take the issue of same-sex marriage. Who branded same-sex marriage as a mainstream issue? Hollywood. Hollywood is the number one branding agent in the world. Hollywood branded Paris as the world's capital of romance. Hollywood branded New York as a capital of police corruption and crime in the 1970s through a string of movies, from Taxi Driver to Mean Streets to Cruising and what have you. And Hollywood branded Las Vegas as the city of sin. What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, The Hangover, and there was a long list of movies that branded Las Vegas. So, I mean, Hollywood has a tremendous power. And I say Hollywood, I just mean I'm using Hollywood as an example to the power of popular culture. So it's way more than just movies and TV. It's music, it's literature, it's magazines, it's journalism, and so on.
That's fascinating. So can we talk a little bit? I know you also served in Los Angeles, and you know Southern California and the Northern Mexico region. I'd like to talk a little bit about the Cali Baja region. The cross-border cities of Tijuana and San Diego have positioned themselves as Cali Baja. They call themselves Cali Baja. The region has 7 million people, combined GDP of $250 million. It's a strong tradition of creativity, innovation, and a really lively gastronomy scene, wineries, artisanal beer. What is the value of positioning a region like Cali Baja to the region?
So usually regions are trying to position themselves as, destinations. So it's mostly about travel. It's mostly about tourism. And indeed, pre-COVID-19, tourism was, again, one of the strongest agents of change in the world, because when you experience a place, there's nothing stronger than experiential marketing. Today, thanks to technology, we can experience places without actually being there. Although it's not the same, there's plenty of research that looks at it and says it's not the same. It's something, but it's not the full thing. So a region like Cali Baja can benefit from several things. The first is, as I said, is tourism, and hopefully post COVID-19, it will become a magnet of tourism. How do you boost tourism? You boost tourism by highlighting usually the lifestyle aspects of the brand. So you mentioned the cuisine, you mentioned arts and crafts, you mentioned everything that has to do with lifestyle, all the way, by the way, to extreme sports. Extreme sports is a very big thing that is a predictor of travel. So we know, for example, in Israel that we have 3 marathons every year, and we have one Iron, I think they call it the Ironman race or something like that, in the desert. So we have 4 major opportunities to brand the Israeli desert and major Israeli cities around extreme sports. And so that's a big part of travel today, especially for millennials and younger people than millennials. So travel, tourism, build a brand around lifestyle assets. The second is, of course, investments. Investments is what we call direct foreign investment, is the money that comes in that goes into the economy. It can be an investment in an existing company. It can be an investment in a new company. It can be an investment in a real estate project, and so on and so forth. This is one of the things that you do. And I think that the close proximity to San Diego is very important in that sense, because San Diego is one of the largest cities in the United States. And I think that the port of San Diego is actually the largest port in California. So San Diego is a big hub of business, and you can definitely benefit from that free transition, free movement of commodities, services, and ideas and human beings. I think that's a tremendous asset that the region can have, is the fact that San Diego and north of San Diego, Los Angeles, are right there. And then the third thing that you do as a region in order to improve your brand, your performance, is to promote your cultural assets outside of your region. Why is that important? It's important because it's a way to communicate your DNA, your assets. What is it that you bring to the table? One of the ways to do it is to help your export brands. For example, if you have a famous tequila brand, let's celebrate it worldwide. And today, with micro marketing and micro targeting, it's very easy to do. It's not so expensive. In the old days of Mad Men, you had to pay a lot of money for what we call blanket advertising. Blanket advertising is the most inefficient, wasteful form of advertising, because you're paying a fortune for a billboard or even a Super Bowl ad, and you really don't know what is the impact of your investment. But when you're using those little devices by way of micro targeting, it's actually very, very easy to crop all the information, to harvest all the information, and to know exactly what worked and what didn't work. You know exactly what delivered the client or the consumer or the participant and what didn't. And so the opposite of above the line blanket advertising is below the line micro targeting. And that's the way to go. That's how you celebrate your assets. And then lastly is the issue of goodwill. When your brand is strong, and we know that from nations, when your country's image is good, when your country is accepted by in the family of nations as a constructive, positive actor, it's easier to maneuver around the world. So if your region, Cali Baja, is going to have a strong brand, if we will do all the things that we said we were going to do, invest in tourism infrastructure, be able to introduce programs to attract investors, be able to celebrate the assets, the cultural assets, the natural assets of the region outside of the region, and then, of course, instill pride in the people of the region and the stakeholders, then it will be easier for us, for example, to raise money in the financial world to finance all the infrastructure projects. It will be easier for us to attract the most famous architects in the world to come and build buildings. The most famous case of a place that improved its positioning thanks to architecture is, of course, the city of Bilbao in Spain. One museum, the Guggenheim, designed by Frank Gehry, really put it on the map. And then you see, of course, Barcelona is another example of a place that really built its reputation around architectural gems. We try to do it also here in Israel with the city of Tel Aviv, that is a bastion of Bauhaus architecture, which is known as the international style. And it worked. It worked for a while. In the early 2000s, there was a great deal of international interest in Tel Aviv, the white city, the city in white, because it was known as the third largest concentration of Bauhaus architecture. So these are the gems that you need to identify and then celebrate internally and then externally.
You know, now that you're saying this, I think you might have hit on something for me. I first came to Tijuana 6 years ago to participate in Tijuana and Obradora. I was serving in Washington, and I was invited out to give a presentation on educational opportunities in the U.S. And I said, hey, this is a really interesting community. There's a lot of creativity going on here, a lot of energy, a lot of interesting things going on. So I think that I may have fallen for that. Later on, I had the opportunity to come here, and I said, this has been great. And I've really felt like I'm at home here. People have really welcomed me. But you mentioned something earlier. You mentioned a place having a DNA. And I think I think of humans having DNA, but can you tell us a little more about what you mean by that? What makes up the DNA of a region or a place?
So usually we use the exercise of personification to make that point. And you try to imagine if a place was a human being, first of all, would it be a man or woman? That's a very big question. We usually describe places, especially countries, in a female form, with the exception of some countries like Israel and Germany, where it's more common for people to use the male form. But usually we say she about a nation or about a city. But then try to imagine, ask yourself guiding questions. If Tijuana was a person, what kind of person? Would that be an old person, a young person, energetic, tired? What body will they have? What's their body structure? Are they heavy? Are they slim? And what kind of personality? Are they bubbly? Are they vibrant? Or are they kind of laid back? And when you do this exercise, personification, it gives you a strong insight, because at the end of the day, if you will take if you will perform a quantitative study, and you will ask people universally, and that's the essence of the brand. If you will ask people across the board universally, when I say Brazil, imagine Brazil as a human being, you will more or less get the same type of person universally, and that's the strength of the brand. So, what does it mean to have a DNA? Sometimes, like in the case of Brazil, the essence of the brand is organic. It's a reflection of many things. None of them was designed by human beings. It's the climate, it's the geographical layout. The climate has a lot to do with the nature of the brand. For example, Spain's brand was everything under the sun. They were playing on two of their main advantages. One was the climate, the fact that there's sun in Southern Europe, and the second is the diversity, the inclusive nature of the Spanish society. So everything under the sun worked. And so one option is to look at your brand as something that evolves organically. And the other, like in the case of Las Vegas, is to say, I'm going to design the brand from A to Z. And sometimes you can combine the two. You can look at your organic assets and then add something that was designed. And you have many cases like that. I mentioned Barcelona, Berlin, Tel Aviv in many ways is a brand that was partly organic because of its closest proximity to the Mediterranean. It's a Mediterranean experience, but also very high-techy, very startup oriented, and that was by design. And the brand that we chose for Tel Aviv back in the 1970s was nonstop, the city nonstop. It's a nonstop action, nonstop everything, and nonstop works because it's not necessarily positive. There are many things that are overbearing about being nonstop. It's not easy to cope with something that is nonstop, right? So there's nonstop traffic jams and nonstop air pollution, nonstop noise, but also nonstop nightlife and nonstop business and nonstop action. And so the good and the bad is very important to maintain that balance. So this is what it means to identify the DNA. You have to go through a process to do that. It's not so easy. The process, which I call R Swim, involves 5 steps with no shortcuts. The first is research. And the purpose of the research is to find out, first of all, who are the stakeholders? Who are the people that own Cali Baja? Who are the people that own Tijuana? Are they only the people that live there? Or maybe the people that own the brand are the people that have a connection to Tijuana. Mm-hmm. I've not been to Tijuana for many years, but I have a strong connection to Tijuana because I have wonderful memories from Tijuana. And I've been there in the 1990s, and I have friends that live there and do business there and so on. So I'm a stakeholder too, although I'm in Jerusalem right now. And if my daughter lived in Tijuana, definitely I am a stakeholder, although I don't live in Tijuana. So that's the purpose of the research, is to identify the turf, identify the stakeholders, and find out what are the strengths and the weaknesses of your place. The second step is the S, strategy. What is the overarching one guiding principle that will help us organize everything that we know about Tijuana or about Cali Baja? The strategy is the heart of the process. If you did the research correct, if you did the research right, the strategy should reflect the findings. The research has to be qualitative and quantitative at the same time. Based on the strategy, you build a work plan, which is the practical translation of the strategy. Usually it requires investments in infrastructure, right? So it's museums, it's universities, colleges, cultural institutions. Then you implement the work plan, which could take years, like in the case of Tel Aviv, it took them years, and then you measure the effectiveness of your plan, of your implementation. That's called the R-SWIM methodology. And that's really the key to the positioning of places.
That's really interesting. I think the biggest challenge that everybody in the world is going to face after we get through this COVID challenge is how do we get back to rejuvenating our economies, and how do we get back to attracting investment, attracting tourists, attracting the economic dynamism to start moving again. And I'm wondering what role sort of post-COVID safety and health and cleanliness and that sort of role will play in that strategy and in that DNA that you're talking about. How do countries or places or regions have to adapt if they want to continue to attract people to rejuvenate their economies after COVID?
Right. So it's an excellent question. The obvious thing is to say, well, hygiene matters, and we need to, if we want to attract tourists in post-COVID-19 world, we have to show them that we are better than the rest, right? So we are going to clean the hotel room twice a day and so on and so forth. I'm not sure it's sustainable, but I think that there's something that runs deeper that is connected to that, and that is the notion of law and order. Lawless places, and I remember when the first reports about what was happening in Italy came out, it was interesting to see how the media attached lack of discipline to the rise in the number of infections. But I don't know if that was indeed the case, but the idea that the media was immediately framing the story in our expectation of the Italians to be disobedient. And again, I'm not saying anything bad about the Italians. I don't think that they're more disobedient than other nations, but it's the idea of lawlessness is very troubling to people. And so I think that a strong sense of law and order, of obedience, of discipline. I'm talking about the ability of people to maintain social distancing. I'm talking about the ability of governments, municipal and national, to actually put effective enforcement in place. Like, for example, in Israel, it was, the Israeli government talks a lot about ending the lockdown, but the truth of the matter is, it was the Israelis who decided to end the first lockdown, not the government. And the Israelis, the day after Passover, they decided enough is enough, and they just stormed the streets, and that was the end of the lockdown. Now they're imposing a new lockdown. I don't even know if Israelis are going to obey. I have no idea, to comply with the lockdown. I have no idea. I have a pretty bad feeling that it's not going to be so easy. So countries like Israel that will project the soft nature of enforcement around COVID-19 will have a very, very difficult time to recover quickly. But countries that will have the ability to project to the world a strong system of enforcement, a strong system of, a swift and harsh response to the virus, I think those countries will have an easier time, because in our minds, the pandemic, and it may have nothing to do with reality, with the medical realities, but in our minds, travel is the number one agent of the pandemic. And therefore, I expect places to respect law and order. And I feel safe when they do that as a consumer. So that's the first thing that has to happen, I believe. It runs really deep. It corresponds with our biggest fears. Just like a COVID-19 really traumatized humanity, if you think about it, because it really corresponded with our deepest, deepest fears. Here we're dealing with something we don't know what it is. We cannot predict its behavior, and it can kill us. And it's the biggest fear that we have. And combines with a very high level of uncertainty. So the first thing that you need to do is increase the level of certainty by highlighting law and order, and it's extremely, extremely important. One of the reasons New York is having such a difficult time to make a comeback right now, and it is making a very slow comeback, is because of the images of the looting in New York. It makes it very difficult for people to, even New Yorkers, to feel safe in New York. And so that's the first thing that would need to happen. Secondly, governments will have to, and I think it's already happening in many, many places, will have to adapt to this new idea of flex economy. What is flex economy? The traditional social contract was designed when life expectancy in the Western world was around 60 to 65. Bismarck was the first who came up with the idea of pension of retirement at the age of 65, because he believed people will not survive to get to He didn't think people will live to be 65 in his time. So it was a very shrewd move on his part. But our children's children are going to have a life expectancy of 90 to 95. We never really planned on those extra 30, 40 years of paying pension. Add to that the fact artificial intelligence is going to eliminate many of the jobs as we know them. Add to that the fact that humanity is expected to move to the big cities by 2050. It is projected that 75% of the people will live in major cities. A major city is 100,000 people and more. And here you have a need to redesign a new social contract. And what will be the new social contract? I believe it will require what we call flexible economy. What is flexible economy? It's economy that is based on the talent and the skill of individuals. In some places, people refer to it as gig economy. I think gig economy is a major component of flex economy, but it's the ability to shift from one sector to another. Let me give an example. COVID-19 created total devastation in the hospitality industry, and you had all of a sudden millions of hotel workers that had nothing to do, but you needed nurses in hospitals, you needed social workers in communities to help the people that were infected, and you didn't have enough. So flex economy is about the ability of a government, again, it could be municipal, regional, or national, to quickly transition from one sector to another, train people quickly from one side within 3 weeks, have people that used to be housekeepers in hotels to help to be, staff people in hospitals and places that where they're needed. And of course, the technological platforms that allow people to make a living based on their talent and skill. There are platforms like that called, for example, there's an Israeli company called Fiverr that is a perfect example of how gig economy will work in the future, where it's an open marketplace where people post their skill and other people hire them. So for example, I do all my video editing using Fiverr, and it's good, it's inexpensive, and it's amazing because I can sit here in Jerusalem and I have my video editor in Madrid, and it's amazing. It's just flawless and it works perfectly. And I think that's the future. So a combination of flex economy and the idea that of safety in in the deepest meaning of safety. What makes people feel safe? Think about it. When you board an airplane, there's a whole ritual. They read the instruction, and the reason of that ritual is to make you feel safe, to make you feel that you're in good hands. Mm-hmm. And it's the same idea with the recovery from COVID-19.
I have never felt safer on an airplane than when I flew on El Al. I will guarantee that. Very special treatment. But I would like to get back to one of the things you'd mentioned, talking about the flex economy and our cell phones and how that's changed things. We're old school diplomats. We worked in an era where the personal connection was the most important. And I still believe the personal connection is the most important thing we can do. But when you're talking about positioning or persuading people or bringing people to think the way you think, how do we do that now with the technology that we have? You're not just in advertising, but how do we use that technology and that changes in the economy to do the old-fashioned job of diplomacy?
So, Israeli scientist Daniel Kahneman of the Hebrew U and Princeton, who was supposed to be with us here in Tijuana, but unfortunately couldn't make it, he won the Nobel Prize in economics. And he wanted the Nobel Prize for his work on understanding judgment and biases in decision-making. And he came to the conclusion that there are two systems. System one, that accounts for most of the decisions that we make. And system one is impulsive, it's usually subliminal. We're not even aware of the decision. For example, when we see other people, we're, the issue of attraction to other people is not something that we can explain to ourselves. It happens within a blink of a second. And then you have system two, which is more rational, um, and it's basically an attempt to explain to ourselves, to rationalize to ourselves all the decisions that we made, the irrational decisions in system one. So system one, system two, there's a clear division um, between the two systems. And so we have to understand the importance of system one decisions, because at the end of the day, what really matters is the ability to create an emotional tie between the consumer, the client, the participant, and that which you represent as a diplomat. And what you can represent as a diplomat, can vary from a policy to values. One of the things that I felt as an Israeli diplomat for many, many years, that I wasn't just representing a policy. I wasn't just representing a government. I was representing an historical narrative. I was representing values. I was representing something that is much bigger than any given politician or any given government. And that's something important, because if you understand Daniel Kahneman's system one approach, then you understand the power of images, then you understand the power of maintaining a healthy, strong emotional connection to a place. I give you back the example of New York. Israelis love New York. Israelis are in love with New York. When something happens in New York, Israelis feel that it happened to them. The number of Israelis, there are 9 million Israelis. Let's say 6 million of them are in a position to travel globally. 500,000 of them, of those 6 million, enter the United States through New York every year. When I told this to Mayor Michael Bloomberg, couldn't believe me. He said, "Are you sure that's the number?" I said, "Yes, 500,000 Israelis." Israelis travel to New York 30% more than the global average when you look at nations. Why? Because Israelis have a very strong connection to New York. That connection is a reflection of a very long history. The fact that Israel's Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion was married in New York City Hall in 1917. His wife was from Brooklyn, Paula Munves, all the way to the fact that the legendary mayor, LaGuardia, was very helpful in the early days of the Zionist movement. The special relationship between Ed Koch in New York, the special relationship between Rudy Giuliani in Israel, and of course Michael Bloomberg in Israel. So there's a very long history that created that emotional tie. On the day of 9/11, millions of Israelis were crying, were sobbing a tear, because they felt that, if you hit New York, you hit Israel. And I think New Yorkers feel the same about Israel, at least most of them. And that's the beauty of it. So that's the job, really, and I agree with you that there's nothing like a real personal connection. But in the age of technology and the digital world, how many people can we touch personally throughout our career? Um, Steve Jobs introduced the first smartphone in 2007 and changed the world, because he allowed people for the first time in history to self-design their own informational feeds, which means that now we're working vis-a-vis a very precise and accurate and sophisticated algorithm, and not vis-a-vis an editor of a newspaper who used to tell us in the old days what's important, what's not. Now we decide what's important, what's not. And the task of the diplomat is to find a way to be relevant to every feed. And believe it or not, the way to do it doesn't go through foreign policy, doesn't go through policy. It goes through life experiences, through personal stories, through anecdotes, a lot of lifestyle, a lot of food, a lot of sports, a lot of leisure. That's what attracts people to online conversations. It's not about policy. And that's the biggest mistake policymakers are making. They think it's all about their policy, and it's not.
You know, I'm fascinated that you had the figure of 500,000 Israeli visitors to New York, because by coincidence, that is the number of Americans that we estimate come to Baja California every year as tourists and as residents. There's a lot of Americans, dual citizens, who live in Baja part of the year, whether Baja California or Baja, or they come as tourists or they come in doing business. And many Americans cross, many Mexicans come across the border. Uh, the San Ysidro crossing is the busiest land border crossing in the world, I'm sure. Even in this age of COVID, when we have travel restrictions, we have over 100,000 people crossing that border every day. It's quite remarkable. And I think that you're right about that personal connection for this region. That may be what makes Cali Baja the region that it is, because people have the personal connections. And the number of people, when I told my American friends on the East Coast that I was moving to Tijuana, the number of people who had recollections of surfing trips to Baja when they were students in college, and people who have fond memories of visiting the Baja Peninsula, it's remarkable. And Californians, especially California and Baja California, have special ties that go way back to, when the Catholic missionaries came to the region and traveled up the peninsula. So it's interesting that you have that same figure. Maybe that it does explain the special relationships. Um, I think this has been a very fascinating discussion. I think that we're probably ready to wrap up here, but I just wondered if you have any other advice to people in the Cali Baja region, sort of going forward. Tijuana is the future. That is the theme. Tijuana es el futuro is the theme of the Tijuana Novadora this year. Do you have any other advice for building the concept of the region for our listeners today?
Yes. So a couple of things. The first is identify your own competitive edge, and it could be more than one. Then find a way to effectively communicate that to relevant people. Most places waste a lot of time, a lot of energy, and a lot of money by communicating their messages to people that are not interested. Again, Israel is an example. That's what we've done for tens of years, communicating messages about a geopolitical conflict that really wasn't relevant to the lives of most people in the world, especially not in Asia. And even in the United States, our research showed that most Americans really don't care about our problems. Most Americans tell us very simply, be relevant to me. Show me, how can you, Israel, be relevant to me? Same thing goes for Baja California or Cali Baja or Tijuana. Show the world how you can be relevant to them. Then they will, and then lastly, which is something we didn't touch upon, the importance of creativity. It is today widely recognized that human creativity is the number one asset. It's more important than oil, it's more important than gold. If you know how to nurture and cultivate and facilitate creativity and innovation, then you have a major advantage. The main reason for the success that we experienced here in Israel as a brand in the last 15 years is because of the fact that our DNA is all about giving people permission to ask questions and to challenge authority. And we created here a nation of problem solvers. And in the United States, obviously, which is the number one hub of creativity in the world, you have 5,500 universities, you have 23 million students. And so that's huge, huge power. And so that's, the last advice I would give to the people of Baja California is find ways to enhance your ability to cultivate and nurture creativity from a very young age. And that will attract all the creative people. And creativity is not just limited to the arts. You find creativity in the military. Israeli military, for example, is a major bastion of creativity. You find creativity in science, obviously, especially in medical research. You find creativity in the arts and culture, and of course, in technology. So, creativity is in all walks of life, and places that are able to celebrate their creative spirit, like Barcelona, like Berlin, like Toronto, like San Francisco, like Los Angeles, New York, have a major, major advantage. And of course, Tel Aviv.
Ambassador Aharoni, this is really interesting, and I really appreciate you taking the time and reaching across the ocean here. It's wonderful to have this technology to have you with us today, and we really thank you for taking the time and for joining us in Tijuana and Ovadora.
Thank you so much for having me.